1992, I made mistakes that I couldn't fix. After a long night of being violent, I ended it with beating a man, taking his wallet, and then trying to run him over with a car. And that's how, at age 17, that I was arrested, charged, and convicted as an adult. At an age where most kids are thinking about their high school prom, or they're thinking about who they're going to vote for next, I was facing 11 years. And while facing those 11 years, again, I had plenty of time to think about all my decisions. So after being sentenced to prison for 11 years, it took, well, you may think it took a lot of all the information that I did receive, that somehow that would get to me, somehow it would get through to me, but it didn't. And then I was finally sentenced to prison, where I met some of the most interesting people you'll ever meet. I met a man who ate mice, rats, and bugs. This man was also serving a life sentence for trying to skin another man after a drug deal went bad. I watched grown men melt into puddles of insanity as their minds could no longer take the conditions of the monotony of being in solitary confinement.
Ellen, sorry, you're muted.
Good morning, good morning, good morning, and welcome to the Justice Beat. This is another installment of the JustUs Youth Talk Show, Season 2, Episode 2. Today's associate producer and interviewer is Jackson Kelly. Take it away, Jackson.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Season 2, Episode 2 of the JustUs Youth Talk Show. Today, we'll be discussing profits over rehabilitation and the impact of privatization on the juvenile justice system. I'm thrilled today to introduce our guest, Mr. Jeff Wallace. Jeff is not just an expert within youth welfare and criminal justice, he is also a testament of the power of resilience and redemption. Good morning, Mr. Wallace. Could you please tell us a bit about your journey and how it led you to do the work that you're currently doing today?
Yeah, so thank you for having me, first of all. And I just want to say that my journey began in a relatively poor environment. I grew up in a three-bedroom house with 8 of us, and it was a duplex. So, growing up in a way that was sort of, you were able to see your parents struggle. You see people around you struggling. And so at some point in time, I decided that I wanted something a little bit more, and I decided to do that through ill-gotten ways by getting involved in criminal activity, gang activity, and even with the educational system, at some point kicked out of the public school system, and eventually placed in multiple juvenile facilities. And while being placed in these different multiple juvenile facilities, I was probably, I would say, 2 or 3 years of doing this back and forth. I finally decided that I wanted to leave that particular facility. It was a locked facility, so I escaped. And once I escaped, I assaulted staff, and that led me to eventually going on sort of a bit of a crime spree. And while doing that, I eventually got caught. And when after I turned 17, I got waived to adult court, placed in prison, spent 6 years in prison, 4 of those years in solitary confinement. And so the thing about this is that while I was in prison, I found people that were unlikely heroes, unlikely mentors, Jackson. And so some of those people actually took the time to talk to me and communicate with me and let me know that they saw something in me that I really didn't see in myself a lot of times. And ironically, it was a lot of the things that people told me when I was growing up, my parents, teachers, and so forth. And so eventually, I knew that at some point, especially after doing those years in solitary confinement, that I needed to leave and that I wasn't going to return. And as I sat there and I watched people come in and go multiple times, that revolving door, I realized early on also that what I needed to do was educate myself. And so eventually, I started really thinking about the things I had did. And I started thinking about the people I had affected, the ripple effect. And during that entire time, I kind of realized that it was just me. I didn't have any visits from family. I spent the whole entire 6 years just basically doing this on my own. And so I started really thinking about the people that I had hurt. And I started thinking about the fact that I had taken so much from this community. And so at some point, me educating myself, reading every book I can get my hands on, what I needed so that when I did get out, I could focus on the ideal of redemption, the ideal of giving back, because I had taken so much. So to answer your question, that's what shapes, that's what fuels, and that's what motivates me. And part of that is learning and understanding that I'm a time traveler. And then I knew that I needed to go back and talk to youth in the same predicament as I was and say to them what I wish somebody would have said to me and give to them what I wish somebody would have gave to me as well and give to them what people did give to me. And so coming out, I knew I needed to enroll in education. I knew that I needed to also give back. And I started off by volunteering in the same facility that I broke out of. And then after volunteering, I knew that I needed to also get my degree. And once I completed that, I started working in that same facility. Then I started overseeing multiple programs, including the program that I ended up breaking out of. So eventually, I received my master's. At one point in time, I oversaw multiple different programs. And then, so that was another sort of aspect of where I was able to see my place within the criminal justice system with juvenile. And then I left that particular part of my career, and I started becoming a social worker. Here's a different aspect of me understanding the system. And then after that, I said, well, I'm doing this. I do enjoy the ideal of being able to be a time traveler to those parents and say to them what I wish people would have said to my parents and what they did say to my parents. And so I started running a day program with the community. It was alternative to detention. And my goal with those kids was to get them to realize that they were a part of that community. They had something to give. And if they could see what I saw in them, that they too could be successful and they can give back. And then eventually I started licensing the same facilities that I lived in as a kid, that I worked in as an adult, that I was a manager in, and I also at some point sent kids to as a social worker. And so being a licensor, I was able to ascertain and understand what exactly this was all really about and all the different details of where people were at, where things were the way they were, understanding administrative law, understanding, how these different codes shape the way that kids are sent there. And while doing that, I became involved in multiple different other initiatives to raise the age for youth, to also be a part of the Juvenile Justice Advisory Council. And in doing all that, I decided, well, I've been doing this. I've been looking at this from multiple different angles. Now I really want to shape the way that professionals and students are actually educated. So then I became a professor of criminal justice. And while doing that, I was able now to help shape the new career force that was going into criminal justice, juvenile justice, social work. And I thought that was really another way that I could be redemptive by giving to them and saying to them things that I knew they needed to hear that they probably wouldn't get if they didn't have a professor like me. And so currently what I'm doing is just working on making sure that there's different projects and things that I'm looking at, but ultimately how we're going to bring trauma-informed care to multiple levels of juvenile justice programming.
Wow, that is very impressive. And in kind of like your journey that you were describing, you were talking about a lot of different experiences, both the personal experience that you were impacted by, having been in the system yourself, and then also later volunteering, and also kind of doing this more alternative work now, focusing more on trauma-informed care. I'm just curious, having been directly impacted as a youth in the juvenile justice system, what are your thoughts on today's topic?
Well, my thoughts are there's a couple different things. One, when I hear the word privatization, right, I think of there's nonprofits and there's for-profits. And today I know we're going to really want to focus on the for-profit, right? But when I think of privatization, I think of the fact that there are so many different ways that we can work with youth. But the way that we can probably hurt them the worst is by placing them into a situation where they now are counted as stock or as cattle in a system that really counts them as a cash product versus an individual that we need to pour into and to give to so they can come out and be their best version. So that should give you an idea of there sort of where my mindset is when it comes to for-profit for youth and privatization, youth facilities.
Very nice. And kind of in your original statement, you were talking about your journey, about how you were both a youth affected within the system, and then kind of moving on as you acquired more and more degrees, how you were doing, how your work changed over time. Could you share with us how maybe your perspective has changed over the different levels of education that you received, and how that might have ultimately kind of changed the trajectory of the work that you had originally done?
Absolutely. I think that initially, you only know what you know, right? And so as a result, you only can do what you can do based on what you know. So the more that you know, Jax, the more that you can do. And so as I started, my initial degree was as pre-law, right? That was my initial degree. And while I was in prison, I did a lot of work. I actually drafted my first successful lawsuit that I hand wrote out and won at the age of 18. And so I knew that law was something that made sense to me. And so, but still I had my perspective, right? And so when I got out and I really wanted to give the kids, I was really thinking to myself, well, I have the perspective of direct care staff as a supervisor, but then going and being around other people that was working in the same field and going to school with the people that had never experienced it, but still had good ideas. I think that my perspective sort of changed in how everybody can individually give based on their different experiences. Everyone doesn't need to jump off a bridge to know that they need to tell someone don't jump off a bridge. And so even though I have lived experiences, I do know that everyone has an experience and that we all can contribute. So I would say that my ability to collaborate with various aspects of the workforce and different people with different experiences was enhanced. But I would say that once I got my master's and I really started understanding research, and I really started understanding numbers, and I started understanding statistics much better, I started questioning things that really didn't make sense. And where are they getting these numbers from? Where is their population? Where are they getting that sample from? And so I think it made me more skeptical as I read things and I looked at things and I questioned pretty much everything. So I would say that ultimately at this point in time, as I'm at the policy level of looking at different things, I'm understanding that the numbers that we're getting that is going to impact and influence policy are numbers that need to be questioned about where they're getting them from, what population are they in fact serving, and what initiative they're serving. Because if we're dealing with for-profit, there's an agenda to pad the numbers to say that this particular thing works, and that's why this is the best thing. And also, we also know that if you're dealing with for-profit, they have an ability to determine who comes into their particular facility. So that means that the kids they're bringing in looks like they're going to be less, they're going to have less mental health issues and less behavior issues. So that means that at some point, a lot of times, they can say the numbers of our kids have less problems when they leave. So that in itself gives you an idea of how education and experience allows your opinion to change based on those different things and experiences.
Yeah, absolutely. And especially when we're looking at that research and taking those samples, we want to make sure that those are representative of the population and communities that we're applying it to. Absolutely.
Absolutely.
Could you share a bit about some of the important work that you've done with the Juvenile Justice Advisory Council and how they're helping young people in the system?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that the biggest thing with that particular working with them and that with their initiative was that I was able to look and examine why kids are coming into detention, right? And how we are we were able to sort of narrow down what assessment tool is being used. So in Iowa, we overlooked and we saw the Iowa detention assessment tool, which really looked at also not only with the crime that they're looking at, but also their demographics, so that we didn't raise the number of disproportionate or disproportionately toward minorities. And so that was one thing that we're using now in Iowa based on the Juvenile Justice Advisory Council's work, and also making sure and really examining the evidence-based programming and what's really been working. We all know that things, you can look at something that may feel good, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it is good. So really, in part of that, doing the work with that council, we were able to really zero in about what people are doing to make sure they're coming from evidence-based programming that allows for better results based on the population they're working with. And lastly, we really focused on the lack of services for female offenders, females in general. I mean, with the gender task force. I mean, right now, and I think this is happening everywhere, girls receive less services all around for a variety of reasons. And as a result, they're either ignored to the point they become adults and then all of a sudden they're in a lot of trouble, or they are just completely looked at as for their behaviors, and the system sort of overreacts to their behaviors because there's so limited amounts of services for female youth.
Yes, absolutely. And in the TED Talk that we just kind of watched on our introductory clip, titled An Insider's Plan for Rehabilitating the Juvenile Justice System, it touched on a bit of how we can maybe reconnect individuals into communities after they've been in prison, and kind of tying back into your comment with assessment tools and evidence-based practice and incorporating that. Could you talk a bit more about like some specific strategies for integrating individuals back into their communities?
Absolutely. And one thing as I'm explaining that, what I'll say is that that TED Talk and where I just sort of outlined an idea and a plan was really truly about restorative justice, right? And restorative justice is really about making everyone whole. And so I think that being able to look at the programs that we're working with and making sure that they are in fact touching everybody. One of the most significant programs that I had an opportunity to witness that was really about affecting the whole community was a program dealing with youngsters that were stealing vehicles, right? We know that that's happening everywhere. And so as a result, it was really not just about focusing on that particular person who has committed the crime, but bringing people together. The one who had the car stolen, the one that stole the car, the community, the members of the community, and also even the detention facility that was providing the alternative to detention programming. And I think that with that particular program, it was an extension of what I was talking about in that TED Talk. And what I had the opportunity of doing also was when I was overseeing the community alternative to detention program, we were really able to get community members involved with them so that they actually felt like they belong to the community. When you send kids away, they don't belong to that community anymore. And as a result, it's easier as a kid to do something to somebody if you don't know who they are. But when we brought kids from the community who had, been in the community already and maybe committed crimes in that community, and now they were helping somebody out with taking care of their leads, something with their church and so forth, they became a part of it. And it was much difficult when they saw a car running because they're thinking, man, maybe that is somebody that I may know them or their family or something like that. So one of the worst things we can do is take kids away and ostracize them on multiple levels, but in particular, kids who may have done things and make them feel like they're not a part of that. Because just as my own personal experience, the more I felt a part of something, the less likely I was to commit a crime as a youngster.
Absolutely. And I think I would totally agree with you that humanization is a far better solution than trying to ostracize those individuals. Could you please explain the concept of restorative justice? You did touch on it very well with the examples that you were using, but just for our viewers
Mm-hmm.
who might be
Yeah,
unfamiliar.
restorative justice, it sounds just like what it says. It actually goes to what in my TED talk, one of the things that people have reached out to me, which is always still astonishing, the fact that, and I'm humbled when people tell me that they've watched it, but one of the things they talk about is when I talk about rehabilitation versus habilitation, right? And so, but the ideal of restorative justice is like being able to give somebody something, right? And so with rehabilitation, the what the words that I use with that, it was really about, okay, how can we rehabilitate someone who wasn't habilitated to begin with, right? But with restorative justice is really about how, in fact, do we restore what you mentioned before, the humanity that we're all born with, the innate value that we all have. And so that's what restorative justice does. It actually does make everyone whole. And we've seen bits and pieces of it, but you also bring in the police department, right? You bring in, one of the things that we would always do is have the police come down to the community program, and now they see the kids and the kids see them in a way that isn't as antagonistic. And now they say, oh, you know what? Maybe I can talk to this person a little bit more. They're playing basketball, they're playing chess or whatever, but that's an aspect of it. Bringing in the community, the educational community, bringing in everyone who was affected by a particular crime, but understanding that ripple effect goes much further than the victim and the particular offender. It affects everybody. So we got to get everybody involved to really restore that basic value of human-centered work that this really requires in order to give kids what they need the most and allow people to show up as their best version every day. Because when you have a crime committed against you, it's difficult. It hurts. It is something that you want to have addressed. But when you can resolve it, you can have closure to it, the better you are and the better you are restored with just that that basic human quality. So restorative justice is just really about making everybody complete.
Absolutely. And then in another TED Talk titled Being Informed to Trauma, you also mentioned another important concept known as trauma-informed care. Could you explain what that also means to our audience?
All right. Trauma-informed care really is simply about looking at someone and saying, what happened to you versus what's wrong with you, right? It's about the lens that you look at the world through, you look at people through, and understanding that there is a basic, again, human quality and human value that we intrinsically all have. And when we can look beyond that particular person and what they've done and actually get into that, then the better we are to treat them. So to give you a good example is if we have a patient who has a broke arm and he's in the emergency room and he's in pain, he's yelling and he's screaming, we're more likely to be understanding with that patient and to understand they're yelling or screaming because their arm or their leg is broken. But what people who are affected by trauma, as we all have understand, if you haven't, know a little bit more about the about ACE scores, right? We know that trauma exhibits on the inside a lot of times. And so when they are screaming out or when they're acting out, a lot of times it's equivalent to that broke leg. They're hurt on the inside. So you have to really truly look at someone and say, what happened to you versus what's wrong with you. And if we do that, we can address the cause versus the result and really be engaged in a process focused concept and sort of lens that allows us to not take things personal and allows us to truly stay solution focused.
Absolutely. And do you think there are other areas in particular, other than perhaps like the juvenile justice system, that are in need of this sort of trauma-informed care?
Absolutely. I can remember, you know, going to, I can just remember going to, on Mother's Day, out of my back window, I can remember as a young kid hearing the commencement speech of a college that was right behind me that I could hear every the year, right? That meant that people were graduating. But I can remember going on, so I used to listen to that and I think to myself, man, I'm never going to college, right? But I remember going on that campus as a kid and getting chased off that campus. I can remember going on that campus as a kid and having a whole lot of issues with the people who worked in there. So that sort of shaped my idea of education, so that when I went to school, where I think we really truly need it the most, because there's a reason why we have an ideal of prison to pipeline concepts and conversations, is because in school, for me, being ostracized took on a whole nother level, based on my own personal experiences of what I was dealing with at home and dealing with poverty and then going to school. But I think that while in school, it was really being able to focus and concentrate. If somebody would have taken the time to understand the chaoticness of what was going on in my home and a lot of other kids' homes, then the better we can work with them. And they wouldn't have put me and my desk right up next to the teacher, right? And then I wouldn't have felt like I was already kind of ostracized and sort of an alien in a place that I didn't know what anything meant, right? And so I think that if we bring in trauma-informed care at the educational level, it's less likely that we will place those kids in alternative schools because we'll know how to work with them. The way that we diagnose students, if we understand what kids are dealing with, then we're less likely to diagnose them with something that deals with conduct disorder versus anxiety or trauma or PTSD or something. And I think that all that will influence the way that the finished product is, and the finished product is better human beings. So I would say in the educational system, our medical system, higher education, law enforcement, everywhere where we have human contact, we have the opportunity to be better human beings to each other. And I truly believe that that is going to be based on the tenets of trauma-informed care, which emphasizes the quality of human value that we all intrinsically have, no matter what we've done, where we come from, or what we look like.
Yeah, I think that's great. I think that's super important that everybody can do that, not just medical professionals. I think, although I think some people might think that hearing that trauma-informed care, that term, that maybe only medical professionals or maybe only mental health professionals can kind of incorporate that. What might that look like for, everyday individuals?
For everyday individuals, it's understanding that those kids you see running around the neighborhood that are getting on your nerves, they're out, at whatever time of the day and the night, they probably need a little help. So it's just really looking at them and saying, what kind of help do they need, right? Now, we know we're living in a world where everything is questioned and there's always an issue, but there's just things as human beings we can do by just asking questions, say, how are you doing today? And I think that's where it begins with being just a decent human being. I've had the opportunity to meet a lot of different people, a lot of different places across the world and all over the United States. And I got to say is that a smile is an international attribute of the way we respond to people and sort of interact with people that they can understand and makes them feel better about who they are. So just as simple as looking at someone and sort of taking away our own sort of barriers to being able to see the humanity in someone, I think allows for us to treat each other better, and our trauma-informed care principles that we can all carry out on a daily basis. I mean, I talk about leadership a lot, right? I do a lot of different discussions on leadership, and one of the things I talk about a lot is transformational leadership. And what that is, it has nothing to do with management. It has nothing to do with who is in this particular role, who's in that particular role. It has everything to do with who, in fact, is inspiring someone to do a little bit more. And for me, a lot of times at one particular job I had, it was the custodian, because every time that I interacted with him, he had a smile, right? And so I was motivated. I'm like, if this guy can smile, I can smile. And I think a lot of times when we're working and just as individuals and in the community and we see a lot of this stuff, we'll be surprised about what just asking questions, smiling, and just looking beyond those external barriers that we sometimes get hung up on, and just treating that person as an individual who may in fact be carrying around all these broken pieces, and they just want somebody to hold them without breaking them, like has happened to them so many other times in their life.
Absolutely. And before our next question, I just wanted to give our viewers a reminder that our Q&A segment will begin at 10:45, so in about 15 minutes. Feel free to write questions in your respective chat on whatever platform you're viewing on. Otherwise, we also have a number you could call in for questions. The phone number is 563-999-3465. So call in with questions, and Mr. Wallace will be answering any questions at 10:45 from our listeners. Jeff, I think one of the things that I noticed across both of the TED Talks that you had were how positive all of the comments were across both videos. In sort of an age where, people can kind of say whatever they want on the internet due to fear, like no fear of repercussion due to like the anonymous nature of it. I was kind of surprised to see how positive that a lot of the messages were just across both videos. What do you think is resonating with a lot of people who are watching both videos?
Well, I think there's two major things that are resonating with people because it resonates with me, Jackson, and that is that first thing being transparency. Listen, at the end of the day, I can only be me, and I can only tell you what I know, and I can't pretend to be somebody I'm not. And part of being who I am is just saying what I've done and understanding and that when I say what I've done and sort of where I'm going, that is me being transparent. The other thing is just that that part of that also is being authentic. Again, it can only be me. So when I speak, when I talk about things, they have to authentically be me and what I've done and where I'm going. And I understand and know that everyone may not necessarily agree with that. And I've had actually, to speak of that, I've had people who did reach out to me and they were critical. And they said, well, why are we celebrating you because of this and because of that? And I said, you're absolutely, I'm understanding where you're coming from and you're right about some of your approaches, but I want you to know that at the end of the day, I'm trying to give back. I've taken so much. And we had a conversation, went back and forth, and actually maybe on one of my YouTube videos. And we went back and forth and we talked, and he was critical of it. And I think that that's another part, is that part of transparency is openness. I'm open. I'm willing for anyone to ask me any question and question anything that I've said, because if I'm being authentic, then all I can give you is the truth. And part of giving you the truth is just saying exactly, unapologetically what it is. And for me, I think that resonates with people when I went in front of audiences and when I go to different places, irregardless of, again, the origin of their country or whatever. I think you have language barriers. When I'm able to just be who I am and they're able to be who they are, and we strip down all these titles and all these different things that we say about who we are, who we're not, we're just human beings. And when you connect with people on a human level, you have the ability to see the value in them and also take the time to see in them a little bit of yourself. And when you're able to see in them yourself, you're able to treat them better, and in essence, able to treat yourself better. And that means that we're treating everybody better. So I think when people hear that and they see that, they can truly just be who they are, because they know that will allow them to be a better person. Jackson.
I completely agree. I think it's evident from across both videos and a lot of the other work that I've seen you do that that level of transparency is really great at just breaking down barriers and having people come together. Kind of coming back and circling back to our topic, which is profits over rehabilitation. Do you have any personal experience with regard to the privatization of the juvenile justice system?
Yeah, I think that well, there's two different ones. One is that depending on the state, depending on the service and the type of facility, there's a lot of privatization going on. Again, we have nonprofits and we have for-profits, right? And so what I want to sort of draw is the distinction between the two, and I'll talk about my own experience with that. One is a lot of nonprofits they're sort of motivated by the ideal of their mission, right? And so as a result, when they reach out for requests for proposals and things of that nature, A lot of the times they're focused on making sure they bring in funds and so forth for the population they're working with. Okay. And so and at the end of the year, they need to break even and they need to meet their goals and the performance goals. But a lot of times they do struggle with that. And a lot of times they end up closing down. And there's some issues with that in general. But then we have the for-profits. Now, my personal experience is that I've worked in a nonprofit private facility. I was housed in one, so I have intimate knowledge of how they work and the differences, right? And I can tell you that one of the things, and just jumping into that I did as a career, is as being a health facility surveyor or a licensor for facilities and juvenile detention facilities in particular. I can remember when the pandemic happened, I was able to see when I called around and I did the census numbers for each facility in that particular state, and I did the infection control surveys, meaning what were they doing to make sure that they didn't have this spread amongst the population. I noticed that all our facilities that were county ran or private, nonprofit, their numbers and census was low, and the only one that was high was our for-profit. And so I think what that showed me is that there is my own personal experience, anecdotal experience, is that there is a obvious desire, invested interest in more youth, more money, and that as a result, you will find yourself doing things that you probably shouldn't do and having kids in places that they probably could leave earlier for the basis of improving the bottom line. So my personal experience with that was that on that level, as far as living in, and I can remember where I was at as a kid. When I look back now, I know that what that was. And I would say that a lot of those people were motivated by the mission, but unfortunately, a lot of times, nonprofits, they struggle with being motivated by the mission, but still having a banker's hat, right? And as a result, they end up going under. And then we have the flip reverse with the for-profit, right? They lose the mission over the profit. So that's been my personal experience. And I know, we'll talk a little bit more about that, but that's my personal experience is one of what I've seen anecdotally and how they work.
To your knowledge, do you know if there are any differences in the services that are available to the youth that are housed in those sort of facilities versus nonprofits versus for-profits?
Well, the thing about if you're dealing with a juvenile detention facility and you're dealing with a for-profit, again, it's about cutting costs. It's about making sure that risks are mitigated, meaning that sometimes you do just the minimum. And also, you have less accountability because you're less transparent. So that means that the programs that you would probably have aren't really going to be that significant in a for-profit because of the fact that you don't really have a vested interest in the community. You don't have a vested interest in making everyone whole. It's more about profits. And a lot of times for these companies, they're not situated headquarter-wise in the same state that they operate from. They have multiple facilities. And and I say nonprofits, but I'll say they're usually county ran or state ran of juvenile detention centers, right? And so for those, there's a vested interest in the community because they have to be accountable to the community. So that means that they do have a vested interest in making sure the numbers go down because the board of supervisors wants to know why is this happening, right? So I would say that the difference in programming is that your county and state ran ones are going to probably have more therapists available. They're going to have more alternatives to detention programs, and the for-profits are going to have things that have more services related to transportation, related to sort of managing the results of the increased amount of youth, if that makes sense, versus what are we going to do to bring that down?
Yeah, and I like the idea that you were discussing partially within that response of accountability and that these more like for-profits are have less accountability in a way because they're trying to cut costs and kind of, cut corners in a certain way. Do you see any ways that, everyday people, or do you see any solutions to holding these for-profit organizations more accountable in the future?
Yes. Cornelius Frederick. And we're going to say his name again, Cornelius Frederick. He was a young man that was he was 16 years old, and about 2 years ago, he was in a for-profit facility that he died in. And so we have to say his name. We have to allow his death to mean something that's a little bit different, right? Than just listening to and reading about the story. And so that organization or that business that operated his facility operated in probably 9 other states, right? And so I think understanding that while we understand that Cornelius Frederick died and got killed in that facility because of the fact that there may have been a lack of experience and so forth in the effort of cutting costs, while we want to be able to look at his name and know that he was a human being and he was a youngster that literally threw a piece of bread, and then that's why he was restrained. We have to also know that we can't wait for the next Cornelius Frederick. What we actually have to do, Jackson, is you got to take initiative. And unfortunately, it's not until a bad thing happens that we then want to react, right? If we're proactive and we understand, so I talk about my experience. I talk about my experience as being a kid, then being a staff, then being a supervisor, then being a person that placed kids in facilities. Then I was a person that that oversaw and licensed facilities. The stuff that I figured out during that journey is tons. And if we have ability to get people to understand average everyday citizens more about their government, their administrative codes that govern these different facilities, and the people they can reach out to, then the less chance that we have another Cornelius that dies in one of these private facilities. And so I think that just getting out there, getting people to understand that these for-profit facilities a lot of times have a lack of accountability because, again, they're taking kids from one state and maybe moving them to another state. And so when someone goes to a whole other state, no one really knows what's going on there. I can remember as a kid going into the different programs I was in, and I remember there was a program in Pennsylvania that a lot of our kids from my state would go to. That's 4 hours. That's 5 states away. And so no one really knew what was going on. I know it got closed down about 2 years ago, but it operated all those years, and I'm 48 now, and it operated all these years. And so I think people need to get involved to understand who's operating in their backyard. When parents hear about their kids going out of state, why is that happening? What's going on there? People need to do their due diligence and understanding. But when you are like I was, and my parents were poor, don't have a lot of resources, the people who are in positions to advocate and to get people to understand have an obligation to make sure people are fully informed about the logistics of what's going on and who's going where, not just, your kids going here and that's it, or not just having someone operate in your community and saying, well, they're supplying good jobs. There's a level of accountability of just proactively knowing who's operating in your backyard and where your neighbors went to, where your kids went to, or whatever, in the effort to try to steer them in the right direction.
Yeah, that's a very tragic story of what happened to Cornelius. And, part of the work that we do here in advocating for juveniles who are going through this system is in part so that that sort of thing never happens again. So thank you for sharing that, Mr. Wallace.
Yeah.
And kind of taking a spin, we'll do one last question before we get into our Q&A segment. With respect to the United States having some of the highest rates of incarceration, and that being no exception for the juvenile population, are you aware of maybe like any other countries internationally that sort of have better facility practices that maybe the United States could learn from?
Yeah, absolutely. The Children's Rights International Network specifically identifies Belgium as being one of the best places that are the best countries that are utilizing restorative and reintegration practices to put youth back into the community. And I think, and actually, I've been there, and actually, my significant other is from there, and I've been there a couple different times as well. And I would say that going in there and also hearing and seeing how things are operated there, there's some things we can learn when it comes to restorative justice and about how we look at people and we understand that they're coming back to our community because a lot of times people, and especially in America, because we've taken on so many different individualistic roles, we don't see ourselves as a community. But when someone comes back to a community and feels as though they're a part of it, then they'll actually give them what they need to make them whole as well. And I think that Belgium is one that I've done the research on. And I saw that as being one of the best juvenile justice systems that out there.
Thank you for sharing that. I think we're going to turn it over now and see if we have any questions from our online platforms, and we'll begin our Q&A segment soon. We have one question in the chat right now asking, how can we make our communities more safer and inviting?
Yeah, I think that one of the things, in addition to being a criminal justice professor, I was also the the diversity coordinator as well. And then at our particular school, I would say it was a very rural area. And in addition to that, our students was 55% of our students were minorities or international students. And one of the things that I started discussing and doing was creating a mechanism to create what I would call courageous conversation, meaning that you bring people in from different areas because we had students coming in and never been in a small town like this. And we got people who live in the town who are like, who are these people that are coming to our community? But once they started communicating, then that elicits safety because now you're not feeling like, who is this person? Who's that person? Conversations is the bridges to being able to feel safe when you're dealing with people you don't know, people you've never talked to. I mean, we've all done it, I mean, we've all looked at someone, never really talked to them. And then next thing you know, we're talking to them. He's like, you know what? When I first met you, I thought this. Well, imagine that at in a town, in a city where only time you see them is when they're right down the street. So I think that what we have to do is create circumstances and experiences that will allow people to have uncomfortable conversations so they can feel better knowing that they know the person that they used to only look at a little bit more intimately because they had a conversation with that person.
That's great. And I think that, again, kind of goes to show the power of just transparency and how that can break down barriers.
Absolutely.
We have another question. What are some of the biggest barriers for incorporating restorative justice practices into programs today?
Yeah, I think some of the biggest barriers is that I have seen are going to come down to in criminal justice, you have the pendulum swinging from justice earth, meaning, hey, we need to punish, right? And to, let everybody go, right? And so unfortunately, that's where the political dollars go a lot of times, right? And so I think that our biggest barrier right now is someone getting a soundbite versus actually having something that really works. And so I think the biggest and part of eliminating that barrier is holding our elected officials more accountable to the things that they're voting on. And that means you have to get involved. That means you have to understand the final product. And that means that they need to know that if they are not supporting the things that are truly bringing about better results, that they may not be serving that next term if that's important to you as related to restorative justice. But I think that we tend to um, just allow people to move legislation with unless it personally affects us, without the level of accountability that would allow for us to be able to say, no, we need this, we need to earmark this money for that. These are the results that we need. And I think that's our biggest barrier, is that there isn't a lot of support for it politically, because all that depends on where the pendulum is swinging and what soundbite is better.
Absolutely. Yeah, the sensationalization of a lot of these things can definitely take a lot of public perception and steal the limelight from a lot of important and relevant issues and sort of strategies that actually work and are evidence-based compared to, what sounds nice.
And it gets drowned out. Like, for example, with this podcast is has got a length of time, right? Which is not the usual, right? Which I think is great, because we've been sort of deduced to 30-second shorts and 214 letters, characters on Twitter, and you can't really encompass such a broad topic with so little words. And so when things get reduced to 30-second clips and TikTok, this, that, and other, that means that we're not having conversations. We are just having those sensationalized tidbits being thrown out there, and people are biting and chomping at it. So, I mean, the accountability is with us, and the accountability is with being able to have those good conversations that will require us to go more than just 30 seconds of a short.
Absolutely. We have another question in the chat. What do you think is the most common misconception or myth that the average person has regarding restorative justice, and how do we address those misconceptions?
I think that people have this idea that people in prison are not getting out, and I'm living proof that I got out, right? And in addition to that, and so they believe that people get put into this here these buildings, or these kids get placed into these buildings, these facilities, and that they're in this tunnel, they're in this silo, and that there's no other people affected by it, right? And that just isn't the case. So I think the more that we can get people to realize that we're here, and we are going to get out, and these youngsters are going to get out, and they're going to go to school with your kids. They're going to be on your kids' football team, basketball team, cheerleading team, and that we're all part of this, doing this together. So I think that people believe, and the biggest misconception is that these kids go someplace, they get fixed, and they come back, or adults go to prison, they never get out, or whatever. But most people get out, and so when people realize and understand that you either invest and make sure that the person who's sitting in that room or in that facility is treated right, and you invest in that, so that when they come out, you want a person who comes out to be to have been invested in, versus someone who's been sitting there bowling for the last 2 or 3 years, or being mistreated in a facility that's about profit. Because at the end of the day, what you sow, you will reap. And I believe in providing and investing in our youth, so that when they do get out, they can actually come out and contribute to society, versus as being pissed off and irritated because they had some very inexperienced, unprofessional, non-solution focused facility not necessarily give them what they needed so they can get out and stay out.
And it looks like we have one more question. Would you consider social work services under the umbrella of restorative justice?
Absolutely. Restorative justice is about everybody. And, and it's one of the things when I went into the criminal justice department as a professor, that I wanted the professors and the students to know is that this isn't necessarily about becoming a police officer, becoming a correctional officer, detective, or CSI person, or whatever. This is about criminal justice administration. So it's really about all the people in the courts. When I taught the courts class, and I would explain to students all the specialized courts, right? And then every time someone goes to court, there's a slew of people that is on a team about that particular person going to court. And so understanding and knowing that part of that school team is social workers, right? I mean, it's like we all have to make this work. And so the pond is much bigger than we realize. And social justice, restorative justice, well, restorative justice in itself encompasses also social work. It encompasses criminal justice. It encompasses it all. And when we start seeing, again, not necessarily individually ourselves and other people, but also with our jobs and other jobs, then we can see the connection. And then we can see the most beautiful asset we have, which is collaboration. Because then we can effectively collaborate with all these different entities for the sole purpose of allowing and making sure that everyone's brought whole again. Because a kid commits, so let's say a kid commits a crime. Well, he goes to court. Depending on what's going on, his parent may have human services involved because they're like, where were you, right? And then another person may get involved. And maybe that unveils something else. We all know about the iceberg, and what's below is much more than what's above. That what's below is much more than we see. So because of that, we have to really see the umbrella as a lot and a much more than just social workers or even whoever else. It's a lot for restorative justice to work.
Yes, and I love that metaphor too, because it's so true. Very, very like little of, what you see is the full picture. Part of the full
Absolutely.
picture. Yeah. It looks like that's all the questions we have from our viewers as of right now.
Okay.
I was just curious, is there any projects, talks, or articles or books that you're working on that our viewers should also be looking out for?
Well, yeah. So one of the things that when I do a lot of my different speaking engagements and go here and go there, I usually always include a list of books, right? Because I think that when people, what I've started to realize, and it just is what it is of me just accepting who I am, is that I do know now that I symbolize something for people. I symbolize the idea that everything you're investing in youth you're working with, you know what, you're investing in someone that could be me, right? And every time in the sense that we do get better. We don't always go to jail and stay in jail and whatever. And so people wanted to know about the books that I read. And I read a lot of different books and I still continue to read. So what I did is I created a YouTube channel that takes a lot of the books that I've read, and I'm just providing them week by week, maybe a couple every week. I just started it where I'm just extrapolating the most important, the most valuable information, putting it into about a 4-minute video, so then that way people can see. Because a lot of times people, people don't want to read a book a lot these days, right? So it's like, here you go, right? Don't do it. I can do it for you. But I extrapolate the most beneficial things out of those books, and I release them, and then I allow people to read them or to listen to that while you're on the treadmill or whatever. And then also a Motivation Monday where I provide a motivational sort of discussion every Monday as well, and bringing about a lot of times the books that I may have reviewed, and just different times that we find that we want to do some things. Sometimes we just don't have that well full, so sometimes we just got to borrow it from somewhere, right? So I try to put a little water back in that well for people. Also, I'm working on a book, and that book is one that I'm trying to collaborate with a variety of people about. But basically what I'm doing is I'm just bringing out my life, the things I've learned, the lessons I've learned, and I'm trying to put it into a digestible form that will allow people to take from that and take the lessons based on the books I read, based on the strategies I utilize, and just making it to a map, right, about how to show up as your best version every day. And then part of that also is I'm taking my own experience of being in juvenile detention centers and other facilities as a kid, and I'm creating a sort of self-help guide for kids who go to detention. And just as something for them, from my experience, I kind of got an idea of what they're feeling when they sit into that cold cell and they're looking around and they're trying to figure out what's next, right? They need to know how to advocate for themselves. They need to know who should I be talking to. And irregardless of the state that they're in, I do believe 100% that there are certain things that are transferable. Any kid, anywhere who's in that situation and who's sitting there wondering,